podcast?
Let's do it.
Well, on that note, allow me to welcome all of you delightful listeners to this brand new episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy. I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony, bringing a real Kennergy to the playgroup this summer.
Have you seen that
No.
movie? Okay.
No, I have not seen it.
So we don't have any idea what that means.
I think it's like the new BDE, but it's Kennergy instead.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that checks out.
I think maybe it's supposed to be like a non-toxic masculinity.
Okay. You know what I think it is, actually, is a marketing ploy.
Yeah, I definitely would not enjoy that movie, and I'm struggling to not be salty about it when people are talking about how culturally relevant it is.
I'm confused by it. I haven't seen this movie either, but growing up, Barbie was always just like the villain. Like it was like this awful brand that represented
The
like
villain.
No, that's absolutely how the language around Barbie was which is also weird because I wasn't in an environment that was particularly progressive in a lot of ways, so I don't know where that was coming from, but that was, I don't know.
Yeah, who taught you Barbie was the villain?
I don't know. And then it's weird having all these like people being like super nostalgic for this thing that was, I thought, pretty widely reviled.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think it definitely was very sexist and crappy for a long time. And I suspect they've probably tried pretty hard to revamp the brand, and this movie is probably a big part of that. You know, I'm sure now you can get a Barbie that is any kind of job because ladies can do whatever they want now, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, any movie about a toy is not going to appeal to me just inherently because of my politics. I don't want to watch a movie about a toy.
So Toy Story, that's right out because of your politics?
Well, I mean, that's not about a specific toy, but I don't love Toy Story either. I mean, I don't love movies that much. I saw
That's
Oppenheimer
true.
yesterday, and everyone's...
Kind of a movie about a toy.
They actually call it a gadget, apparently. This is apparently during the building of the bomb. They didn't refer to it as a bomb, I guess.
Because that would be really uncomfortable,
I
to
guess
be
to have
honest
some
about
sort
what you
of
were doing.
intellectual distance from it.
Intellectual distance, that's
Just
the
a
word,
very
yeah.
explosive gadget. I don't know. Everyone's talking about how great this movie is. I think it's fine. And I'm not a big movie fan, so my criticism of movies should be taken with a huge grain of salt because I don't really like movies that much, so who cares what I think about them. But this whole movie, it was 3 hours long, and it felt like...
so long.
I don't even mind that. I can do a long movie. It just felt like a 3 hour long trailer, though. Like, every single line of dialogue had a music bed under it the entire time. And the score was constantly building to these like big crescendos the way that like a trailer does, where like the sound gets louder and louder. So much loud sound. Like it wasn't even... There's obviously the one scene where a bomb blows up. That's pretty loud, as you would expect.
I would guess, yeah.
But there's also just tons of other scenes that are equally as loud, where it's just like people in a gymnasium or whatever, and it's just so loud. I sound so old right now.
Yeah, I was going to say, you've never sounded more like an old man. The movie was too loud.
It was too loud, but just the production value, it
four stars, too loud.
It felt like it was desperate for your attention. Like, it didn't want you to look away for a second. Like, when it started, I felt like, is this a trailer for the movie we're about to watch? But then it was actually the movie, and then it didn't stop for 3 hours. It was like a 3 hour long trailer. It was really... Also, some really cheeseball moments, like the way they have all these like cameos from famous physicists, and you're supposed to be like, oh, I know that guy. I've heard the name Niels Bohr or whatever. Mm-hmm. Very cheesy for those of us that have read the Wikipedia page about the American nuclear program multiple times from top to bottom.
Wow. Well, sorry you're old, I guess.
I wanted to like it. I am morbidly fascinated with nuclear stuff. You know this about me. I think nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, nuclear disasters, it's so fascinating to me. I love to read about it. It's like I had the revelation the other day that it is to me what true crime is to so many women in my life, where like they're really into true crime and I don't get it. I'm like, why would you want to listen to a crime the entire time? And then I'm reading a whole article about the exact way.
Why would you listen to a crime?
I mean,
It's a good question. It's a good question.
I prefer my podcast to be all about like fun, levity,
true
people
crime,
goofing around.
Like trucks full of stuff crashing and dumping all their contents across the highway.
Sure, I guess there are some crimes in Punta Vista.
People shooting themselves with their own firearms, non-lethally.
Bang, bang, bang. Yeah, but anyway, I think that
arguably the opposite of crime.
My like fascination with engineering disasters, specifically around nuclear technology, is the same base reptile brain motivation that leads so many people in my life to be like, I want to hear all of the inner details of a serial killer. That's fascinating to me. Meanwhile, I don't want to hear that at all. No, thank you. Get that right out. Anyway, I felt like I was primed to like the movie a lot. We went and saw it on the IMAX, which is maybe why it was too loud, because they're like... They're like, we got these big speakers, got to show them off, got to make everybody deaf before they leave. Also, the IMAX is a little underwhelming.
Wow.
I grew up...
What's one positive thing from this week?
There were a couple of good scenes in the movie that I thought were well done. It wasn't a bad movie. It was just, I would say, solidly mediocre and thought a lot of itself. It was like very self-important, which rubs me the wrong way when I think you made a mediocre movie, but it feels like it's a big, important movie. We're going to get a lot of mail about this, I feel.
You're going to get a lot of mail about this.
People are going to have opinions about Barbie. People are going to have opinions about Oppenheimer.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't actually matter if we talk about Magic the Gathering, what we do, because this is the only thing that people are going to write in about and talk about in the Discord and wherever else people are talking about
We'll just have to say something even more bombastic.
Quick, say that Nissa is a small game card.
Boy, this just keeps coming up. Just to clarify, I said Nissa doesn't make the game bigger. And yeah, sure, man. Look, we're not opening this again. We're not getting into this again. This thing keeps coming back to bite me. And whatever. I'm just saying it doesn't add game pieces to the board. That's a fact. Save us, Anthony. What are we talking about this week?
Why don't we talk about cube restrictions? I feel like this is just a big aspect of cube design, is a lot of people are not just playing with literally whatever cards they want. There's some other structure that restricts what set of cards that they're going to put in their cubes. So it's kind of weird that we haven't talked about it yet in 2 years.
Well, it's funny.
How long have we been doing this podcast?
I'm
3
sure
years?
we've talked about it in some small ways, but I think you and we just don't really design cubes with those kinds of restrictions. Partially because us and our play group are fine with proxies. So, in the Degenerate Microcube, I'm like, sure, here's a mountain that I wrote Bazaar of Baghdad on. Like, that counts. So budget is not an issue because if we want to play with the card, we'll just play with it. And then I think you and at least I, find other restrictions to be like almost a shorthand for power maxing. Like, if you tell me you have a restriction about like, oh, this cube is only 2 colors or this cube is only uncommons or whatever, and that's like your description of how the cube is designed, then I assume you're filling in the gaps with, and beyond that, I made it as powerful as I felt was reasonable, which, yeah, I don't know. I think that the more novel restrictions of like making the kind of gameplay you want to create in a cube like the regular cube is the kind of restrictions we prefer to pursue, rather than saying, I'm only going to play uncommons, even though this one rare looks so perfect for my cube. I mean, this actually is relevant right now because there are a ton of big pauper downshifts in Commander Legends. Some cards that, it's actually really interesting, too, to me that the Spirit of Pauper, right, playing with commons, and there is definitely a through line in the design patterns of commons from standard sets, but that doesn't apply at all to sets that are not meant to be drafted. And so, like, Commander Legends, they just put a black set symbol on Dread Return, and, like, would Dread Return ever be a common in a standard legal set? No, but now it's legal in Pauper, and so everyone's really excited about it, and I can't get excited about that.
And this is another thing you don't want people to be excited about.
I don't care if they're excited about it. I'm just saying I personally can't get excited about it because you could have put Dread Return in your cube the entire time, whether it has a black set symbol on it or not. Anyway, for all these reasons, I feel like it is not a topic we touch on regularly, but I agree that it is something that a lot of cube designers are dealing with, and so it's worth investigating and talking about further.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that you're touching on there, well, you touched on a couple different things of just like, why do people have restrictions at all? And I think that budget is something you mentioned, which is obviously going to be a big restriction for a lot of people. And while you're at the point of doing budget, it's also reasonable to kind of reframe the structure because, prices of cards change and fluctuate and things like that. So just saying, well, I'm going to restrict my cube design to just uncommons and commons, or even just commons, is a pretty reasonable shorthand for keeping it within a budget while not necessarily worrying too much about the details of prices. Although plenty of people also do just like, no card costs more than $1 when I first purchase it or whatever.
Yeah.
The other thing you touched on is just that it creates a different design. Like it's going to force you to do something different, which is, I think, the bigger reason why people design within restrictions is if you are just designing from all of the cards that exist that have ever been printed, it's really hard to kind of break out of that mold of, well, I'm going to start with, 360 of the best cards in Magic's history, and then maybe, I'm going to not include power because this is kind of like high variance gameplay I'm not interested in, and maybe also some budget reasons why you wouldn't want to include power. And then maybe you exclude some other things because you don't really like the play patterns of Oko, but still a lot of people will end up just sort of in that area of playing largely with 360 of the 450 most powerful cards from the history of the game. And it's kind of hard to break out of that and like justify your decisions of just saying like, well, I'm just going to play a bunch of other cards that, don't fit that mold or aren't appealing for players in a normal like context talking about limited or constructed. It is a weird shift to make. And so creating your own restriction of just playing with a certain rarity, a certain color, a certain aesthetic is an easy way to push yourself to do something different. Or the shorthand that we say far too often and don't really define is that restrictions breed creativity. By putting yourself in a situation of trying to solve a problem with different materials or solve a different problem, it's going to force you to look at all of Magic in a different way and come up with a different solution than you would if you didn't have those restrictions.
Yeah, I think where it's most valuable actually is not just a like self-imposed restriction on yourself, but when that restriction allows you to better discuss the cube with people on Cube subreddits or Cube Twitter or Cube Discords or whatever, where there's like a whole Pauper committee that basically heads up the Pauper Cube, and it's because they have a whole community that is all focused on this one restriction, and then that means that it's much easier to talk about the viability of a card because there's a shared context, basically, that everybody is playing with. I've been looking at all of the cubes that are going to be at CubeCon this year for reasons that will become known to the audience at some point in the future. And I noticed there are only 2 peasant cubes out of all the 48 cubes that are going to be at CubeCon, and there are 0 pauper cubes. I was actually looking at the cube map, and I was like, what is this huge chunk of island over here that has no representation at CubeCon? And it was pauper. There's just not a single pauper cube at CubeCon. And it made me wonder if, I think we've definitely witnessed a renaissance of sorts in how people think about cube design, where if you go back 5-10 years, what cube meant to people really was the most powerful cards in Magic's history, with some affordances for personal bias or taste. But now it's so much more common to see cards with more novel restrictions that are not things like rarity or budget or whatever, but are things like, here's the kind of gameplay I want to create, or, I'm trying to create this vibe or this feeling of this plane or something, that I wonder if we will see less and less of cubes that just describe themselves as pauper or peasant cubes. And to be clear, there's 2 cubes that are labeled peasant. Maybe there are other cubes that are all uncommons only, but the way that the cube is pitched, the name, the description doesn't make that front and center. But I thought that was really interesting. There's just not a single pauper cube at all of CubeCon, and I don't think there were any submitted. I tried to go through the big spreadsheet that the CubeCon organizers shared that kind of showed the cubes that are going to be voted on, and I didn't immediately see a cube that was pauper that was submitted. So I was surprised, because if you'd asked me how popular are pauper cubes, I would have said very popular, one of the biggest subcategories or types of cube you can make. But I do wonder if those kind of restrictions are starting to wane.
Yeah, I think that the point about it being easier to talk about, especially when you're doing shared design, is super important and super valuable, because I think sort of what you're hinting at is if you're going for a certain gameplay, maybe you're playing with mostly commons, but there's a couple uncommons that are totally reasonable and would actually improve the experience or offer something a little bit different. But if you're doing sort of a shared design, or even just getting input from people, that sort of space of it's mostly common, but it's kind of up to me to judge if something feels like a reasonable fit or not.
Definitely hard to communicate really with your play group about.
And this is something that I've struggled with my primary cube, where it is very different from, especially at the time, what most cube designers were doing, but I didn't have any hard restrictions. That's kind of the joke of it being called regular cube, is it's not a gimmicky thing. There's no rarity or budget or any kind of restrictions. Mostly it's cheap stuff. It's mostly uncommons. But if there's something that feels appropriate, or
but it's not
cheap
or uncommon because you sought that out. It's because the kind of cards you like to play with just happen to often be cheap and uncommon.
But that was a big challenge in just communicating, even to our local play group initially. It's why are you choosing these cards instead of why don't you play this functionally more powerful version? It's well, I think that wouldn't really scale in the same way. It wouldn't create the same kind of gameplay experience. It wouldn't lead to the same evaluation decisions of opening a pack and those kinds of things. I don't know if you want to call that a kind of restriction itself, but is much, much more difficult to communicate about and sell to people than just it is about commons. If it has a black mana symbol, or not a black mana symbol, it has a black set symbol, it is okay. That's super easy to digest.
Yeah, it's also easier to communicate with yourself about that. I think we've discussed before how I think setting your own power level, your own goals is really hard because you don't have all of that common knowledge that all the people that have been playing those powerful cards in Cube for all of time have, where you can ask how good a given card is, and lots of people have played it in very powerful cubes, and they can weigh in and give you that sort of context. If you ask somebody how good a card is in the regular cube, unless it's a random person online is going to have no idea, right? Because they can look at the list and maybe guess how it plays, but they're not going to know because they've never played it and it is totally unique. And so it's much harder to have those kinds of conversations with people about what's an appropriate ad or whatever because they don't really know the environment that well.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think related to that, it also is an easy way to sort of give an identity to a cube. Again, like I've had a little bit of a challenge with regular cube where it's like, these are just the cards I like. Whereas if somebody says, here's my cube, it's restricted around, maybe it's a horror cube, so maybe it's going for an aesthetic theme, or it's just using cards that come from a certain plane, you immediately get a huge sort of identity and structure and like hook to communicate what the cube is about from that restriction itself. And it's not necessarily just about the card choices and informing the gameplay. That kind of like sales pitch is really relevant when you're trying to make a thing that you want to get people to engage with and, get people to sit down at the table and play.
Yeah. I've been doing little like lettering exercises for all of the cubes in our play group, partially for fun, partially for a fun little project, which...
Partially for fun, partially for different fun, meta fun.
Yeah, for two different kinds of fun. But it's definitely striking me, like, I looked at the whole list of cubes, and I'm like, well, some of these I immediately have, like, it's an idea. It's a concept that can be visualized, and some of them it's like, what do I do for this? Including both of our main cubes, like, regular cube. I mean, there's some visual joke to be made of just making it the most neutral and plain lettering possible. The Bun Magic cube, like, you could put a bun on it, but that's not really the whole point.
That's funny.
That's not really the point of it, so...
At least it's the word.
So yeah, I don't know. So, yes... That is a real thing that matters when you are designing a cube, and especially if you're trying to grow your play group or get people that don't already know you and your cube interested in playing. So that's where those restrictions can also be really handy, because in a simple word, this is a peasant cube. Anybody that knows what peasant is will know vaguely what that means, right? They will know that they're not going to open some bomb mythic rare. They're not going to get beaten by a planeswalker. They know the sort of landscape just with a single word, which is so much harder to communicate if you have any kind of novel restrictions or you're making your own way in the world.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that sort of opportunity to set expectations for players is really, really powerful when you can say, this is an environment that plays like Pauper or plays like Modern. Like, you have expectations about how am I going to evaluate cards when I'm looking at my first pack. Like, this is a card that I know is powerful in Constructed Pauper, so I expect it to perform a certain way here. And those restrictions just allow you to pass on those expectations so players know how to evaluate things. And when they lose to a card that's really powerful, they are going to have a better time of it because they expected it to. That's a card they know is going to be powerful. Whereas if you're doing something that is much softer and squishier, that like lack of expectation might just put players in a spot where they can have a lot less fun.
Mm-hmm. To talk about rarity restrictions, I have often seen pauper cubes, commons only. I've seen a lot of peasant cubes, commons and uncommons only. And every time I've seen this, these people have always followed all official printings, which includes supplemental product. I think if I were to do this, I would honestly maybe just completely exclude any non-drafted product from my rarity restricted cube, because again, in those products, rarity is like completely arbitrary, or it's like serving a totally different purpose. Like, I don't think I'd put any commander or whatever cards in my pauper or peasant cube if I was doing it. Those are very common. I've never seen somebody that has a no mythic rare cube. Have you heard of this before? I mean, it's theoretically possible, but...
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about the sort of like supplemental products, I think that's a really great call out, and I'm really curious sort of how the community shakes out and deals with this in the future, because I think it's maybe less about is a thing drafted or not, which I think is super important, but a lot of these supplemental products now are draftable. You know, we have Commander Masters, I think is a draftable set. We have Commander Legends, Battle of Baldur Gate. These are drafted sets, but they are multiplayer sets, and multiplayer just changes the game in such a huge, huge way that they just can't design cards in the same way to have a fun draft experience. So I feel like the draftable, not draftable is a good point, and like this thing that we should consider when we're thinking about what cards make sense and how do the sort of like rarity levels actually get applied to cards. I think multiplayer versus not also has a huge, huge impact. And if anything, I would look at that first to think about, are they actually applying rarity in the same way? And for me, the answer is absolutely not. They are like reasonably making cards at different rarities that work differently for multiplayer because it is a different game. Yeah, I mean, just kind of makes that restriction more challenging to me.
Yeah, I mean, if I cared about what it meant to be a common or an uncommon, I would definitely not look at those cards at all.
Yeah.
But it's kind of similar to like the people that have a old school cube that play some of the new cards that have been retroactively old bordered, where it's like, it's not really an old border card. It is technically because they printed it this way, but in the spirit in which it was designed, it's not really fitting that description. But I have a mostly old border cube that I explicitly break that rule on whenever I feel like it, because again, I don't like card restrictions, so I totally get why people do that. But the question is like, what is he really trying to capture, right?
Yeah.
And in the case of some old border cubes, I think it's an aesthetic thing. It's just they like the look of the old border and the consistency of all the cards being that way. And so who cares when it was printed and retroactively old bordered. And who cares if it's got mutate and it's a DFC? Just jam it in there if it's old border.
The no mythic rare question is interesting, and I first wanted to sort of like say that's not super important. Like mythic rares form a pretty small percentage of all cards that are printed, but I actually think it would be like, do you offhand have a sense of in your cube what percentage is mythic rare versus not?
I know that way more of my cube is actually common and uncommon than I think most people would expect at first blush, and I don't know how much of it is mythic. I don't think very much, actually, almost at all. Let's look. You keep talking. I'll look it up.
Yeah, I mean, I think this would actually be something, not necessarily I would say, like, let's jump in and start doing some designs in this space, but I think that it would be really interesting to go look at a bunch of cubes and see what fraction is mythic rare, and get a sense of, are there patterns how this kind of restriction would actually shape environments differently. My guess is the way that mythic rares are often printed is they're often big splashy effects. It's something you open in your draft pack and it's like, wow, this card is so cool, I want to put this in my commander deck. Not necessarily, staples that they expect to be in constructed decks forever that are often printed at common level removal spells that are just going to be relevant in different formats and relevant in draft. So I think that we would especially see a lot of mythic rares at like cubes that run a lot of 4+ mana cards that are relevant, and that's sort of like what the gameplay revolves around. And that fits that's not necessarily what your cube is all about. It's much more low curving. It's much more about, you know, 1-for-1 interactions and things like that. Yeah,
despite being really powerful, it's not about those big haymaker plays. I have 36 cards in my 360 card cube that are mythic rare, though a couple of them have been printed at not mythic rare. It's just the printing I happen to have is mythic. So really it's just like less than 10% of my cube is mythic rare, despite being a very powerful environment.
10% is still a big chunk. Like that's definitely going to it would change your cube a lot to take out those 10%. I think in my cube I run 1 mythic rare, maybe there's 2. But it is kind of funny, again, just to like look at the way they've designed different cards, different rarities throughout history. And
you liar.
No. I can see it from here.
6 mythic rares.
6 mythic rares. But some of these are like, they were powerful cards at the time, maybe. But it's like, they made the best landfall card they could, except for Tireless Tracker. And it's like kind of a middling creature.
Yeah, some of the mythic rares in my cube are surprising. Like, I forgot that Grim Flayer and Seagate Stormcaller are mythic rares. These cards don't strike me as particularly mythic.
I will never forget that because I remember someone in our play group being furious about how they kept printing standard staples at mythic.
Which one of those was a standard staple?
I think Grim Flayer was like notable.
Oh, that was a while ago, but yeah, maybe it was playable in standard. This is kind of related to a restriction that I see pretty often, which is just a no Planeswalker restriction. I see people making cubes with this as a stated restriction pretty frequently still, even though Planeswalkers have gotten more and more popular in Magic as a whole. Although there is that recent news that Wizards is scaling back to printing one and only one Planeswalker in sets moving forward for the foreseeable future. What do you think of that?
I don't.
You don't care? Irrelevant?
We just haven't been playing Limited all that much, and I don't play a lot of Planeswalkers in most of my cubes. I feel like they're just cards that often can sort of be like really advantage the player who is ahead, which isn't the kind of gameplay I'm usually looking for. I also feel like a lot of Planeswalker designs are pretty similar, so that just sort of like makes sense that they're like, yeah, this isn't necessarily contributing to the gameplay experience in the same way that we want.
I think they've gotten a lot better in the past few years at making more varied Planeswalkers. It definitely felt for a while there like every Planeswalker was uptick, defend itself, downtick, some kind of card advantage, ultimate you win the game. And obviously that recipe works, which is why we saw it so many times. But I think the more interesting question about the Planeswalkers is like, I have 7 Planeswalkers in my cube right now, which is not that many, I think, for a very powerful cube at this size. I am more interested in the question of, does this change in the density of Planeswalkers being printed indicate a more like low-level change to the kinds of games that Wizards is trying to value, maybe especially in Standard? It seems to me like it's have the biggest impact on Standard because there will just be a third to a quarter as many Planeswalkers in Standard. Well, I guess they also just doubled the period of Standard now, so maybe these things are all going to kind of offset. But
that's a good point. They actually might be making adjustments. Well, I'm sure they're making adjustments based on that different rotation, and this could be part of it.
Yeah, I mean, trying to balance like 40 Planeswalkers in Standard would be
sounds tough,
hard, and Planeswalkers definitely lead to a certain type of gameplay that some players really enjoy and some players don't, and I think that type of gameplay has been more common since like the Fire design era of Magic, where almost every card is kind of like a high value haymaker. The card advantages abundant in all colors, and the game just kind of gets bigger and more goes on. Lots of game pieces and actions are happening. Those are the kind of games that I think Planeswalkers tend to lead to. For the most part, again, generalization, Liliana of the Veil does exist, makes the game smaller, but I wonder if this is indicative that they are maybe leaning a little bit away from that kind of gameplay, and one practical way to do that is just to say, hey, let's print fewer complicated board size increasing permanents at high rarity and high power level.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure also there are some flavor and story reasons about a lot of Planeswalkers losing their spark after events. But
how are 2 Planeswalkers ever going to kiss anymore if there's only ever one in a set? I'm asking the important questions. Fanfic authors everywhere want to know how their Planeswalkers are going to kiss.
Plus, Magic is more and more just moving towards multiplayer and towards Commander, and Planeswalkers tend to be a card type that doesn't function as well in Commander because of all kinds of mechanical reasons. So I think, like most decisions, it's not based on just one thing, and a lot of these factors probably contribute. So there's a bunch of reasons for these kinds of cube restrictions. It, gives your cube some identity. It gives you restrictions to force you to solve novel problems in different ways. It can just help you build things in a reasonable way. If you're building around a budget or like access to specific cards, having hard restrictions can just support those other limitations that you have designing your cube. Should we talk about just some of the other restrictions that people put on themselves to design novel cubes in this way?
Yeah, hit me with some more.
So I think the big ones that we've sort of touched on are obviously like rarity, budget, and like format. So talking about like, this is my modern cube or my vintage cube are going to play a little bit different. And again, it sets player expectations. It gives you kind of a benchmark around what kind of gameplay you're looking for built in because players are familiar with those formats and how they play. A little further afield, I think that you're right. We've just seen a huge proliferation of cube design going in more and more novel and creative directions, and we see people doing a lot of like color-restricted cubes where they just only play 1 or 2 or 3 colors. You said that we have no cubes with hard design restrictions. I did for a long time have a mono black cube, which was sort of experimental. True. And it definitely forced me to think about stuff in a different way and think about,
just how bad Withering Boon is.
Yeah, I had to talk about that. That wasn't
so
fun.
Many people wanted you to add Withering Boon to that cube.
And what's the other one? Withering Boon and Dashed Hopes, is that what it's called? A lot of people have been also exploring like mana value restrictions. So...
Well, real quick, on the color restriction one, that to me does feel like a very different restriction because it is so fundamentally about like the color pie and the question of how does Magic change if you remove a whole color from the environment. And I do think, for better or worse, that there has been some convergence of the color pie in recent years in terms of just like what colors can do. More colors can do more things, which I don't have bad feelings about. It's a change in Magic. But I think if you go back to like old school era, like if you were to take a color out of the neoclassical cube, that would be a massive change because you would just have entire effects that are no longer present. Whole like strategies wouldn't work anymore. I feel like now you can have a 3 or 4 colored cube and kind of not even really notice, right? Like the Brea cube in our play group,
which is a cube that has no green, so it's all themed around this one card that is Brea.
And the designer even has now a version of the cube that has green, and I can't tell you what's different between them. I mean, I know one's got green cards, but like there's no difference in the gameplay. There's no difference in, to me at least, like how the environments feel. They both feel a lot like the designer and the kinds of games the designer likes and the kinds of cards the designer likes. I don't feel the lack of green or the presence of green.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about how Magic design has changed, and especially I feel this playing more of your old school neoclassical cube where, yeah, I mean, sometimes your opponent plays a card and you're just like, I can't beat that in these colors. Like, I sure wish I had like drafted that one sideboard piece,
right.
Or like the
you're playing red
here.
And they play something with more than 4 toughness and you're like, well, bye. Guess I'll die then.
And I think you're totally right that in modern design, it's like every color has creatures. Every color has a fair amount of different kinds of interaction and things like that. And sure, it's worse. In green, you're going to get a 4-mana 4/4 with 5 different upsides. And in blue, it's going to be a 4-mana 3/4 with only 3 or 4 different upsides. But yeah, I mean, you can still build a suite of interactive cards among any colors. It's also relevant that my experience with color restricted cubes is when you actually start playing the games, things feel pretty normal because it's like the mirror matches are going to happen in any cube environment.
You have
like,
plenty of matches of Magic that don't have a color or two colors present.
Right. So like we are already more used to that experience than we think we are. It does sometimes feel different in the draft, and there are just going to be some things that are not present, maybe certain types of interaction, but it's also often like much harder to realize what is missing from an experience than what is present. So it just sort of feels like the things that are present in that part of the color pie are just a little bit louder.
Yeah, we played the Jund cube of T-Pug like a month or so ago, or whenever that was. I'm so bad at time. A while ago, we played this cube.
Anywhere between a week and 6 months.
Something like that. And it felt like the break to me in some ways, where the color-restricted cubes I've played like this feel like they are essentially like love letters to that color identity. Like it's made by a designer that really loves that color combination and what it's capable of, and just wants everyone to be doing that, right? And so in the Jund Cube...
Why does everyone simply not play Jund?
I mean, the Jund Cube, it did kind of feel like almost everything was a mirror match. Because when you go down to 3 colors, or 2 or 1, it's so much easier to just have everybody playing, a little bit of every color, right? At least, like... I think there was like 2 solid 2-color decks in our draft pod, but almost everybody else was playing, 2 with a splash of the third. And so everyone's got a little bit of everything in their deck. The one thing I did remember about that draft in particular was that I did feel like I made some draft decisions knowing that my opponent would never have a counterspell.
Yes,
I was like, okay,
that is true.
Here's the one thing that is a meaningful difference, which is that my spells are going to resolve, and that matters. It makes some cards much better than they would be in an environment where you can just get your thing mana leaked and feel really bad about it. But aside from that, like you said, once you get into the games, it's just Magic, and so it's a really easy way, I think, to curate the kind of experience you want, right? If you just don't like counterspells, which a lot of players don't, then just don't put them in your cube. And the easiest way to do that and make people know without having to like communicate a bunch of rules and restrictions and like your design principles is just to say there's no blue. And everyone's going to know immediately, oh, there's no counterspells then.
Yeah, that's a really great point, is that, I mean, again, going back to like player expectations and presentation and how you sort of get people to understand what's going on, it's more words and takes more like investment on players to understand there is no counterspells, but there is no blue communicates that in a very visible way.
Yeah, the more we talk about this, the more I think those kind of knock-on restrictions are the big deal, right?
Yeah.
Like I think when you say you're playing a peasant cube, I think what a lot of players like shortcut to is like, all right, no Planeswalkers.
No Planeswalkers.
No Planeswalkers.
No Wraths, except now there are some, but...
Yeah, but I mean, like, to me, I think that's one of the biggest things. The same way if you say, it's the Jund Cube, you're like, all right, no counterspells.
Yeah.
Like, this is good. Or, like, very little exile removal or whatever. Like, it does communicate a bunch of knock-on things that go a long way to describing the kind of environment you're going to be playing.
Yeah. Yeah, and there is a lot of sort of strategic depth that it adds. Like, if you just sit down and draft the Jund Cube, you can not think about that and you'll just have a normal feeling experience. But if you are thinking strategically, you will evaluate fixing a little bit differently in the draft, and you will evaluate what kind of interaction your opponent is going to have, and that's going to inform potentially some of your decisions. But again, that like is only there if you're opting into trying to optimize that situation.
Yeah, I'll say that I definitely did not want to be playing an aggressive deck of the Jund Cube, personally. When everyone's Jund, I don't want to be the one with 1 mana 2/1s in my deck, personally.
Yeah.
But as I understand, I think T-Pug has said those decks have had a lot of success in the past too, so maybe it can still get there. But my own personal preferences, I was like, all right, for everyone's doing Jund, I'm going to try and be a big old mid-range deck, bigger than my opponent's mid-range deck.
That's just smart.
Well, I only went 2/1, so
Well, I drafted Birthing Pod .deck and never cast Birthing Pod once, so you're ahead of me.
Get good scrub. Skill issue.
So colors are a big one that we've seen more and more sort of restricted cubes, and I think that even though sort of where I landed on my own color restricted cube was the color pie is cool and nice and I like it, but it still is like definitely a way to create a very different experience and force you to like look really deep in one slice of the color pie, which is very cool, and potentially find cards that then if you go build another non-restricted card, you're going to then, have that in your sort of repertoire of things that you know how to play with or how to fit into a design.
It's one of the most direct ways to experience the thing that we say all the time, which is just like put cards in your cube that foster the kind of games you want. I think so often people, when they're making a like normal cube, think it's got to have a certain amount of counter magic and a certain amount of discard spells and a certain amount of removal and a certain amount of 5 mana spells or whatever. And it's like, no, it doesn't need any of that. In the same way that you don't have to put blue in there at all, you also don't have to put any 5 mana spells if you want. Like, you can just put the kind of cards in that lead to the kind of games you want, and it will work. Like, you will just get more of those kind of games, which is, it's a very like hardline way to enforce that. Like,
yeah, absolutely.
You don't like white? Great. No more white.
So you mentioned mana value. That's something else that I feel like we've seen more and more. I got the chance to play at CubeCon last year, a cube that played with only cards that were mana value 2 or less, and Patrick in our local playgroup was inspired by that and is building his own cube with the same restrictions. This one is maybe a little bit less resonant, a little bit less exciting than, you're just on this wedge of the color pie and it's totally different.
It's not as visual. You know what Jund looks like. You don't know what 2 mana value or less looks like.
But I think it still has all the same add-ons of forcing you to look at things differently and just build the cube differently. It also has a weird twist that mana value is not necessarily implemented in a consistent way. Like a lot of cards that you're practically spending 6 mana on, technically, they've got an X in the cost, or, it's got an expensive cycling cost. So even though there's a 2 up in the corner, you're mostly paying 6 mana.
Or you're leveling up your Hex Drinker.
For sure, yeah, that's a great example. And I think that even though I don't think Hex Drinkers should be in those kinds of cubes specifically.
Or any kinds of
cubes, maybe. Sorry, Jet. I do think that those kinds of experiences are really fun to think about, like, oh wow, Magic is actually kind of weird and like does this one thing in a couple different ways, and there's this aspect of card design that I didn't really think about, and that can absolutely inform how you then design less novel environments because you're just used to using your brain and thinking about these cards in a different way.
Yeah, I actually don't think that like exceptional case is like the predominant feeling of a cube like Tupelo Honey, Patrick's 2 mana value cube. Like I think it mostly just feels like, oh, we're all playing small spells.
Yeah.
And every once in a while, sure, someone's got a
Hex Drinker
or a Stonecoil Serpent, and you're like, okay, I mean that's technically a 2 mana spell, but not really. But for the most part, it just feels like you're playing with a bunch of small spells. Something I've realized playing those kinds of cubes that I think is counterintuitive is that I think you often think, okay, everyone's doing small stuff. These games are going to be fast. Like they're going to be like really, aggressive and quick because everyone's going to be casting spells immediately. And what I found in that cube and also another cube which has a very different restriction in our playgroup where all the creatures are small is the best way to describe it, is that the games are actually much grindier because no one has that like pull ahead, big, turn the corner kind of spell because everyone's got small ball. Most of my cube is 2 mana value or less, the vast majority of it. But the ones that cost 3 mana value or more are having a big impact on games, such that even though it's only 20% of the cube or whatever, it does have a big impact on how the cube plays relative to a cube like Tupelo Honey, which only has the low stuff.
I think there's also sort of a funny sort of chain of metagame events where if you're playing a cube with lots of big expensive stuff, you can kind of take advantage of that metagame by playing a bunch of 1 mana 2/1s and beat your opponent before they get to do their big things. But in a cube where everybody's spells cost only 1 and 2 mana, everybody's going to have at least a 2-drop on turn 2, probably a 1-drop as well, which just makes it a lot harder to actually have those games where you're just taking advantage of the way that people are hoping to play out the games.
Yeah, I mean, just imagine being an aggro deck trying to win when you know your opponent's deck only has 1 and 2 drops in it.
Yeah.
What are they? Are they creatures or removal spells? Because either one of those really messes up your strategy. Are they a third type of card? Is it just non-board affecting cantrips?
They just cast Night's Whisper 4 turns in a row.
Yeah, exactly. That's the best you can hope for, because if their spells are all castable, then as the aggro deck, you are trying to capitalize on the fact that you're going to leave your opponent dead with cards left in their hand that they just never had a chance to cast. If they had a chance to cast all their cards and you still won, then it's a very different kind of matchup.
The next big restriction that I see a lot and is very high in sort of the like compelling and resonant and good to talk about is aesthetic restrictions. I think this sort of is adjacent to restrictions that are to a specific plane or to a specific set. So it's like this is the Innistrad Horror Cube or this is the Theros Cube, and I'm only pulling from sets that took place in Theros. And, maybe there's also core sets adjacent to those sets. And this is another good opportunity to shout out the MTG Multiverse project, which catalogs a lot of those cards. So you can, if you want the canonical list of what's every card that took place in a particular theme, you can find it. I think one of the biggest things that these kinds of aesthetic restrictions provide, in addition to just, again, being like resonant and making the cube easy to talk about and present, is it just cuts down on the number of cards that you're looking at. Looking at all 27,000 Magic cards is a lot. So just saying, hey, we're now looking at 3,000 cards is a lot more manageable.
Yeah. Cube design is always about finding that little start of an idea that you can then kind of build on. And it's really hard to find that start of an idea if you're kind of aimless and looking through 30,000 Magic cards. But if you have a direction, or you're like, I'm going to limit it to horror-themed only, and you look at all the horror-themed cards and you think, wow, these few cards really stand out to me as like fun cards I want to play with. What kinds of cards would go in a deck with these? What kinds of cards would make these cards shine? then you're just snowballing. You start rolling down the hill of just, adding cards you like until you get to a place where the cube is playable. You just have to get to that point, and I think having any kind of aesthetic restriction is a great way to at least get you to that point.
For sure.
What I'll say about all of these restrictions, which this is kind of how I was going to close the episode, but I'll say it now because it seems relevant, is I think these are all great places to start a cube. I would strongly encourage people to, once they've got a cube they like, to maybe loosen up on their restrictions, because you've done the hard stuff, right? You've really gotten the most benefit out of having those restrictions, but now, if there's a rare card you like, if there's a card that's not quite horror, I mean, obviously, if the horror thing is really what you're there for, if you really are there for the aesthetic nature of the cube, that's your main reason to do it, then don't break the thing. But if you really want to play a card, don't be like, I wish I could, but I can't because of this rule I made up. Just do whatever you want at that point,
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, if we're talking specifically about the creativity aspect, you did the constraint. You had the creative process. You discovered something that you wouldn't have discovered if you were just solving the problem in the same normal way that you always would.
And now you discovered a new cool solution that you also want to include that you are now hamstringing yourself to allow yourself to do.
So let that creativity be fostered, and then don't let it hamper you, and feel free to be a little bit looser, I think.
Which is actually, this is exactly how I did the Neoclassical Cube. I didn't add any new cards to it, even though I knew I was going to. I didn't really add any new cards to it, except for a couple that I was like, I'm going to put Burst Landing in there. It's got kicker.
You broke the restriction pretty.
Faithless Looting, I was like, that's definitely going in there. But there was only a couple, and I really just stuck to the old school cards to figure out what the actual archetypes of the cube were going to be. I didn't want archetypes to be shaped by new cards. I didn't want them to be the pieces that made a deck viable. I wanted them to be there to complement the things that were already extant in old border Magic. So for the longest time, it was really just old border cards. And then once I got to a place where I started to see these themes emerging, I was like, okay, the cycling deck is cool, but it really could use a little bit of oomph, and the modern cycling cards are just a much better rate than the old cycling cards, and so I could go in and add those cards and make it work. But I think starting with the restriction and then opening up as the shape of your environment starts to come into view is the way to do it.
Yeah, I guess what I would say to that is, don't feel like you're giving up if you're loosening your restrictions that you set on yourself at some point. At some point, it might just make sense, and you can still feel okay about that.
Yeah, put a rare into your peasant cube every now and then.
As a treat. There's a very, very long tail, just had to get that in there, of restrictions that you can apply.
I'm sorry, I just got reminded of a time that your first battle box you used to have. I remember once we were playing at the LGS years and years ago, and you just shuffled in one powerful rare card, and you just called it the special guest.
I never actually did that, but I did joke about it a bunch.
I thought you did do it at one point.
Special guest, the Scarab God. Which, everything else in there is like a 4-mana 3/3 that maybe does something.
But I like the idea of you having a peasant cube with a special guest. Every time you draft it, it's like, special guest tonight is Jason the Mind Sculptor, and it's fine. Everyone can
It's fine. I mean, I did try this a little bit with the irregular cube, which is different from the regular cube, where I had this sort of set of rare cards, with the idea being people like opening up
That
Black
wasn't
Lotus.
strictly rarity related, though, right?
It was not, but it was definitely this is a card that is let's take World Knit or Sovereign's Realm. These are cards that the very first iteration of my main cube included some of these cards, and they got cut.
Then you played with them twice, and you were like, well, that's enough.
It was that was not fun. The person who had those cards just steamrolled everybody. But I've been trying to put them in other contexts where it's is this fun every once in a while? Yeah, not really. It's a shame. Special guests. So there is a huge, huge swath of other restrictions. I think those are the big ones, but you could imagine any aspect of a card, anything you could search for on Scryfall, you could put some constraints in yourself to just make yourself look at cards a little bit differently. And also stuff that isn't actually printed on the card. So we've seen, for example, on MTGO, they did the Nega Cube that included only cards that were not included in any other one of the cubes. And we mentioned this a couple weeks ago, and a couple people are interested in doing this for CubeCon, working with the... I forget the numbers offhand. I think
the pool of cards that is in no cubes at CubeCon 2023, which we won't know until the lists are actually locked in early September. But I'm really excited to see what comes out of that, because that, I think, it's a much bigger list, obviously, than a single cube, and it covers so much ground, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to be a difficult restriction just because there are so many cards in the cubes that are going to be featured at CubeCon. I forget the numbers offhand, but we'll present those at some point. And
the other thing we have to do is...
You can't put any card in that has a picture of a boat on it, for example.
Boats are right out. I think the other thing about that restriction is you have to also lock in the cards that were legal when the cubes were locked in 2023. No new cards in the 2023 Nega Cube for CubeCon, but I'm excited to see where that ends up.
We mentioned also that just cutting out a color often excludes certain effects, or cutting out a rarity might exclude things like Planeswalkers or counterspells. You can also just set restrictions based on particular things like that. You could even say, like, this is the all sorcery speed cube. I'm playing this with new people.
Let's call it the portal cube.
Instants are confusing. Yeah, we'll just make the portal cube. You can absolutely do that. And I don't know what else. Just go click on look at a magic card. Where's a magic card?
We were talking about these knock-on restrictions where, like, you have one restriction, but what it actually communicates is this, like, secondary restriction, which is maybe more important. I like the idea of having this CubeCon Nega Cube, and it's just drafted by people that hated CubeCon 2023. They're like,
did you go to CubeCon? No, this is the cube for you.
Did you hate your draft experience at CubeCon last year? Then here you go. Here's the opposite of that. All cards that were not in any of the cubes at CubeCon 2023. It's going to be hard to make that cube good, I think. It's going to be a lot of work.
It's going to be a lot of work. It's also means...
It's definitely going to be possible, because it's still, like, I don't know, what, 15,000 cards. It's still a lot of cards, even though there are thousands and thousands in the cubes at CubeCon. It's just... because of all the varied restrictions and design goals, people have really picked over the cards for the cards they want to play the most. And this is the 15,000 people least want to play. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how we make something fun out of that.
It's also just going to be difficult because the tooling that supports us, it really makes you appreciate the stuff you take for granted about, like, how easy it is to search for cards on Scryfall and, compare lists on Cube Cobra and things like that when you have this artificial restriction that doesn't work as well with all those tools.
I tried to just import the whole list of cards not in the cubes into Cube Cobra into the maybe board, and I was like, I'll just do it this way.
Oh, no.
And Cube Cobra did not like this. It was unhappy with me.
Nope.
It did not work.
That's the day that Andy broke Cube Cobra.
We'll have to talk to Gwen and get him to, just stick it in the back, right in the database, manually or something.
I don't know if that's what the issue is.
What do you think the issue is?
Let's not talk about websites.
I assumed it was something about...
How do you think websites work?
I assumed it was something about, waiting for some response from something, and there was too much data, and the responses were taking too long.
That's a great point, yeah.
But if you just create the record and say, here's the list.
I don't think
whatever.
the page will load.
Oh, you mean in the browser, once it exists, you don't think it'll load?
Correct, yeah.
The cube with 20-some thousand hidden gibbons loads.
Does it?
Yeah.
When was the last time you tried to load the Hidden Gibbons cube?
It's been a minute, but I've definitely seen it with 30-some thousand copies of Hidden Gibbons. Though, admittedly, it's all the same card.
It exists anymore, because I think that it did break Cube Cobra.
It was deleted by the admins.
Somebody was having a fun, casual...
DDoS.
Somebody was having a fun spamming to break Cube Cobra as a bit, and it broke it.
Don't DDoS your friends.
Don't.
Friends don't DDoS friends, everybody. Anyway, yes, it's going to be hard just functionally to design that cube. Also, I'm just thinking of all the categories of cards that there'll be none left. There will be no 1-mana cantrips left. There will be no 2-mana counterspells left. There will probably be nothing that costs 1 or 2 mana that taps for mana left. No mana dork of any kind.
No card from Innistrad or Ravnica will be left.
Yeah, that's true. The set cubes will have nothing. So, all the most popular planes will be totally picked over. Mm-hmm. It's going to be really interesting.
It's not going to be as hard as the 2024 CubeCon Nega Cube, though.
When you include the 2023 Nega Cube in the list of cubes.
Oh, no, you're right.
And it just is literally every card then at that point? Well, it would just be the new cards that were printed since 2023 that no one included in a cube.
Well, I mean, it's only going to cut another 360 to 540 cards from that pool, so I think it's just going to be more difficult because it's going to be twice as big again.
Also, how many awesome hidden gems are we going to find in that list of cards that nobody is including in their cubes?
I want to say a lot. It would be very funny to me if everybody's just like, yeah, we don't want to play with any of these cards.
I can't even, can you name a single card that you think is not in any of the cubes? I don't think, if I could come up with it off the top of my head, I think it's almost guaranteed to be in a cube. Hill Giant. Is Hill Giant in any of the cubes at CubeCon? You got the list of your computer.
I just deleted it.
Great.
I'll remake that list.
Anyway, that's a fun restriction you could also do. Some complicated restriction you can't search on Scryfall for, and the card pool is too big to upload to Cube Cobra, so you just got to manually check every time you think of a card you want to include whether or not it's from the database.
Yeah, I'll make some validation scripts for anybody that wants. We'll make some custom tooling to make this ultimate Nega Cube.
Sick. What are the major restrictions that we not touched on?
I think we touched all of them.
At least the ones that can be described these are one-word restrictions.
Yeah, I mean, we're saying...
Obviously, there's lots of more nuanced restrictions, but these are the one-word ones that I think communicate a lot with very little, which is very valuable. Is that an episode of Lucky Paper Radio?
I think so. It just might be.
I want to take a minute to mention our friend Scotty Mertz, who has been on the podcast before, who's been on the YouTube channel before, is working on getting a play group and regular Cube Night started in Brooklyn in New York. I'm sure we have a lot of listeners in Brooklyn, New York. If you are one of them, check out Upkeep New York on Twitter, I think. If I'm wrong, I'll just replace it in post with the correct name of the Twitter account. They're doing registration ahead of time, so because, space is limited in New York local game stores. So if you want to check that out, please do. We're also always trying to do whatever we can to help people build their local play groups. So if you are trying to build a local thing yourself and you have somewhere you want us to point people, shoot us an email. We'll shout it out on the show so that we can help everybody find their own little beautiful local Cube play group. Wow.
You'll have to see it.
And that's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All of the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This show is produced by Anthony and I, thinking really hard about Magic cards and then speaking into microphones about it. Thanks for making this podcast, Anthony.
Thanks for making the podcast with me.
Thanks for making the podcast with me. I'm going to isolate that little piece of audio and replay it a couple times. It was a good one.
Just for you? Just for yourself?
Just for me, a little special one.